Everyone in that room believes intelligence is what determines who wins. It isn't, and the data on this is no longer even close. Researchers who tested emotional intelligence against 33 other workplace skills found something that should unsettle anyone still betting everything on raw IQ. Emotional intelligence alone explained 58% of performance across every industry, every role, every level they measured. 90% of top performers scored high on it. Only 20% of the bottom performers did. I don't say this to flatter emotion. I say it because the data makes something clear, that most people refuse to accept the ability to read, regulate, and deploy emotion correctly isn't a soft skill sitting beside real intelligence. In practice, it functions as the primary variable deciding who actually wins. Sit still. I'm walking through exactly what this capability is built from, what the real data says about it, and precisely how it gets trained, without the sentimentality most people attach to this subject. The framework, almost every serious American institution, still uses traces back to a psychologist who broke the concept into 5 distinct, trainable components, rather than treating it as one vague trait. Self-awareness, self-regulation, internal motivation, empathy, social skill. Self-awareness comes first, because everything downstream depends on it. It's the capacity to accurately identify what you're feeling, in real time, along with what specifically triggered it. Not a vague sense of being fine or off, but precise recognition of the actual emotional state and its cause. Most people operate with almost none of this. They feel irritation and call it exhaustion. They feel fear and call it caution. Without accurate labeling, nothing downstream can be regulated, because you cannot manage what you haven't correctly identified. Self-regulation is what happens next, the capacity to control or redirect a disruptive impulse before it controls you instead. This is not suppression. It's the deliberate act of creating space between an emotional trigger and the behavior that follows it, long enough for judgment to actually participate in the outcome. Internal motivation is a specific kind of drive, one anchored to something beyond money or status, sustaining effort even when no external reward is watching. Empathy is the accurate reading of what someone else is experiencing, without requiring them to state it directly. And social skill is what these first 4 components make possible. Once combine the capacity to navigate relationships, influence outcomes, and manage conflict with precision, because everything beneath it is already functioning correctly. None of these 5 were classified as fixed traits you're either born with or without. They were classified as learned capabilities, which means the entire hierarchy is trainable, deliberately, by anyone willing to actually do the work most people skip. Strategy without stakes is just philosophy. Here are the stakes, quantified. People with high measured emotional intelligence earn, on average, $29,000 more per year than people with low emotional intelligence. The relationship is direct enough that researchers found every single point increase in measured EQ adds roughly $1,300 to annual salary. This correlation holds across industries, across regions, across every level of seniority studied. At the organizational level, the numbers compound further. One well-documented case involved a major consumer goods company that restructured its hiring criteria for a sales division around emotional intelligence competencies rather than traditional metrics alone. The salespeople hired under the new criteria outsold their counterparts by roughly $90,000 per year each, contributing an organizational sales increase in the millions, and they were 63% less likely to leave the company. Retention and performance, moving together from the same underlying variable. A cross-industry study involving a major American telecommunications provider found that increased emotional intelligence, measured directly, accounted for 20% more productivity among leaders compared to their lower-scoring counterparts. Separate research on senior partners at a multinational consulting firm found that high EQ partners generated over $1 million more in profit per partner than their low EQ peers, a gain exceeding 100% in relative terms. This is not a motivational claim dressed up as data. This is what the labor market is already paying for, whether or not the people earning it can articulate why. Strip the abstraction away, and the contrast becomes obvious in a single high-stakes room. Low emotional intelligence, under pressure, looks like this. A defensive tone, the instant feedback arrives, regardless of whether the feedback was accurate. an inability to separate a critique of the work from a threat to identity, escalating volume and disagreement, as though louder automatically means more correct, a complete blindness to how one's own tone is landing on the people still in the room, because attention is entirely consumed by the internal reaction, with nothing left over to monitor its effect outward. High emotional intelligence, under the exact same pressure, looks almost unremarkable by comparison, which is precisely the point. A brief pause before responding to criticism, long enough to separate the content from the delivery. A question asked instead of a defense mounted. A voice that stays level not because nothing is being felt internally, but because what's being felt has been correctly identified and deliberately kept out of the outward response until it's useful rather than reactive. The difference isn't intensity of feeling. Both people in that room may be experiencing something equally strong internally. The difference is entirely in what happens between the trigger and the behavior, the exact mechanism the 5-component framework was built to train. Here is where most content on this subject stops being useful, offering vague encouragement instead of an actual method. The training that works is more specific than practice mindfulness, or be more empathetic. The most reliable, evidence-supported starting point is emotional granularity, the deliberate practice of labeling internal states with far more precision than the handful of vague words most people default to. Not bad. Specifically, is this frustration, disappointment, embarrassment, or resentment, because each of those, correctly identified, calls for a different response, and lumping them together as bad guarantees a generic, often wrong reaction. People who practice this consistently show measurably better regulation, because the brain cannot effectively manage an emotion it hasn't precisely named. The second method is somatic tracking, noticing where an emotional state manifests physically before it fully registers cognitively. Tight jaw, shallow breath, a specific tension in the shoulders. Emotional reactions almost always announce themselves in the body before the conscious mind catches up to what's happening. And learning to read that early physical signal creates additional seconds of warning seconds that are often the entire difference between a regulated response and a reactive one. The third is deliberate exposure to controlled friction, practicing the pause specifically in low-stakes disagreements, so the skill is already built by the time a high-stakes one arrives. Nobody develops this capability for the first time in the middle of the moment that actually matters. It has to be rehearsed beforehand, in situations cheap enough to fail in. Here's where I diverge from how this subject usually gets presented, because the sentimental version of emotional intelligence conveniently ignores its failure modes. There is a documented pattern researchers describe as toxic empathy, where the capacity to accurately read and absorb other people's emotional states becomes a liability rather than a strength, leaving the empathic party chronically overextended, unable to maintain boundaries, and gradually depleted by carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. High empathy without paired self-regulation isn't a complete skill. It's half of one, and the unfinished half is what produces burnout in exactly the people who appear, on the surface, to be doing emotional intelligence correctly. There's a second failure mode worth naming precisely: suppression disguised as regulation. A calm exterior is not, by itself, evidence of emotional intelligence. Genuine regulation processes the emotion internally and then makes a deliberate choice about external expression. Suppression skips the processing step entirely, simply refusing the emotion access to the surface, and the research is consistent that this version carries a real physiological cost over time, showing up eventually as elevated stress markers and, ironically, worse decision-making under pressure than if the emotion had been acknowledged in the first place. And it's worth being explicit about something Goleman's own framework doesn't fully account for. High social skill and high cognitive empathy, without underlying ethical character, are precisely the toolkit found in individuals scoring high on manipulative personality traits. Reading people accurately and knowing exactly which lever moves them is a neutral capability. What determines whether it becomes leadership or exploitation was never contained in the 5 components themselves. It's a separate variable, and pretending otherwise is exactly how well-intentioned EQ training occasionally produces more effective manipulators instead of better leaders. Recent workplace data confirms this isn't a static, decades-old framework people are still reciting out of habit. Reporting collected from thousands of assessments and hundreds of leadership and HR professionals found more than a third of respondents currently struggling to balance personal well-being against workplace demands. and fewer than half of organizations feeling genuinely prepared for the pace of change they're already experiencing. Self-awareness showed up as the most commonly reported strength, meaning the entry point of the framework is where most people are furthest along, and regulation, motivation, and applied social skill are consistently where the actual gap remains. Team-level data reinforces the same conclusion at scale. Teams measured for collective emotional intelligence were found to be substantially more willing to experiment with new approaches, and organizations with strong collaborative practices showed measurably lower turnover and meaningfully higher productivity and profitability than those without it. This is not a personal development curiosity anymore. It's showing up directly on balance sheets. Strip everything above down to something usable, and the sequence is precise, not vague. Build self-awareness first, through granular labeling of what you're actually feeling, and why nothing else in the framework functions without this. Build self-regulation second, through deliberate practice, creating space between trigger and response, and situations cheap enough to get wrong. Only then does empathy become something you can deploy, with boundaries intact, rather than something that quietly drains you. Only then does social skill become genuine influence, rather than performance without substance underneath it. Skip the sequence, and you get exactly the failure modes described above: empathy without regulation, calm without genuine processing, social skill without the internal foundation to support it honestly. The room still thinks intelligence alone determines who wins. The data has said otherwise for over 2 decades, and the gap between what's been measured and what most people actually act on remains enormous. You now have the actual framework, not the sentimental version of it. 5 components, each individually trainable. A measurable market, rewarding the people who train them. A specific, evidence-backed method for building the capability, rather than simply hoping it develops on its own. And an honest account of exactly where this skill breaks down when practiced, without its necessary boundaries. Most people will nod along and change nothing. The 5% who actually build this, deliberately, in low-stakes moments long before the high-stakes ones arrive, those are the people the data has been describing this entire time. The room rewards composure it can't fully explain. Now you understand precisely what's actually being measured underneath it.